Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Hands Where I Can See Them, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by FlyingBlueBirds, and you can find a link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Britt. Hands Where I Can See Them. Chapter 21. Epilogue. Tally's and Sarah's relationship was never perfect. Far from it, actually. They struggled, they fought, they had to adjust themselves to their new situation. But not once did they doubt the love they had for each other. And in the end, all of this, all of their ups and downs, was what made their relationship so strong, what quickly turned it into one constant both Sarah and Tally seemed to have needed in their lives. It's what made it their own kind of perfect, so perfectly imperfect. They struggled, especially when the trial for the Camarilla killer case started to draw nearer. It started as a small shadow looming over them, creeping closer and closer, and ultimately shed enough darkness on both of them that their demons were begging to be let out and pushed them to face their past once more. Tally had mostly been struggling with her panic attacks. The fact that she would have to face Kara Brand again when she would testify in court was not sitting well with her at all. More than once she woke up, drenched in sweat, Kara's stone-cold voice still ringing in her ears, the imaginary pressure of her blade still noticeable on her stomach. It made sleeping hard again, and soon, the only thing that had been able to calm her down was Sarah's strong arms, which wrapped themselves tightly around Tally's slim body and gave her the safety she so desperately needed. Sarah had mostly been struggling with her lingering self-doubt. She kept blaming herself, that she should have recognized what Silver was up to much sooner. She constantly beat herself up, constantly reminded herself that she could have stopped all of this way sooner if she had only paid enough attention. It made sleeping hard again, and soon, the only thing that had been able to give her head a much-needed pause were Tally's strong arms, which pulled Sarah's restless body close and gave her the reassurance she so desperately needed. What they both struggled with equally were the horrors that kept being revealed. The horrors about Blatant Silver, whose story had quickly turned out to be far worse than anything they had imagined. Silver himself had died in that apartment, had stopped breathing even before the ambulance had arrived at the scene. Tally had always thought that taking a life would break her, would leave her reeked with guilt and unable to cope. But in the end, killing Silver, even though it was in self-defense, had made Tally feel absolutely nothing else but relief. She didn't regret killing him. Still, with Silver gone, the only person who was able to give them any sort of reliable information had been Kara Brand. The woman had done well to cover her surprise when they had told her that they had found out about Silver, and thus had taken her last trump card away. She had barely even flinched at the revelation, and soon had found a way to use it to her advantage. Knowing all of this was truly over, she had taken great pleasure to explain in every detail how Silver was involved in the case. It was without any question that she used this to distinguish herself. She seemed to feast on the looks of shock and disgust her words drew from the faces of whoever was currently interrogating her. It had made her laugh, had given her the opportunity to revel in her actions one last time. These reactions were, after all, the only thing she had left. Yet, in an absolutely horrible way, her words made complete sense, leaving absolutely no reason to doubt her. Apparently, Silver hadn't really been himself ever since his wife died. On the outside, he'd been living the perfect life, had had a successful career, and had been the perfect father for his daughter. On the inside, however, he had been rotting. He had been desperately looking for someone to blame for his wife's death, and the one person who had been giving him the perfect outlet for his anger had been Penelope, his own daughter. His own daughter, whose only mistake had been that she had lived. Silver hadn't been able to understand why it couldn't have been her, why it had been his wife who had to die, the only person he had ever truly loved. Slowly but steadily, he had started to hate his daughter, had hated to see her grow up, had hated how she had started to resemble her mother more and more. To fuel his hatred, he had started to follow Penelope whenever she had been out. He had watched her spending time at Fort Salem, had stalked her through the windows of the bar like the psychopath he had been, had watched her laughing with her friends, had watched her holding hands with a couple of girls, had watched her laugh, drink, and simply enjoy her life, and it had made him livid. That was when Silver had actively started to develop fantasies about hurting his daughter. He had never acted on them, though, had been too much of a coward to actually get his hands dirty. That had been until that one fateful evening. Just like so many other nights, he had watched Penelope spending another night at the bar, had watched her rejecting the advances of the barkeeper quite forcefully, and getting celebrated for her actions by her friends. It hadn't bothered him more than anything else his daughter had done. He hadn't interfered. For all he had cared, the barkeeper could have had his way with his daughter. At that time, she had been nothing to him anymore. He had already been sitting in his car, had been ready to leave, when he had spotted Penelope leaving the bar, clearly drugged, tumbling, way more than alcohol usually would make a person tumble, a dark shadow behind her, following her. To him, it had seemed like the universe had finally answered one of his prayers. It had, indeed, been a very convenient turn of events, and he had stayed put, ready to let things play out on their own. He had watched a blonde woman sneaking up on his daughter, waiting for the moment the drug in her system would be taking over, waiting until she had finally collapsed on the sideway. She had dragged her into the back of her car, in which someone else was already waiting, and then they had taken off. Silver had followed the woman to an abandoned building, had sneaked inside and spotted his daughter lying on the cold stone floor. He had watched the woman talking to his still unconscious daughter for a while, had watched the man that had been with her, whom he had quickly identified as the barkeeper, grazing his daughter's skin with a gloved hand, smelling her hair, breathing her in. It hadn't infected him at all. He had been mesmerized by it. Mesmerized by the blonde woman stepping forward once more, a dagger in her hand, sliding Penelope's throat in one swift movement. He could have stopped her, but he hadn't wanted to. According to Kara, he had described to her how a strange satisfaction had overcome him when he had listened to Penelope slowly choking on her own blood. She had thought it had all been over when he had confronted her, when he had caught her, leaning over Penelope's body, watching the life leaving her. But it had been the beginning of everything. Just like herself, Silver had needed more, had needed to relive that feeling. It had been far too easy for him to convince some of his buddies to testify that they had been playing poker with him all night. Everybody had felt so sorry for him, had mourned the loss of his daughter, and didn't suspect a single thing. And ever since, Silver had been careful not to be anywhere near the actual crime scenes. No. He had preferred the dark basement where the actual murders took place, and even then he had made sure that he hadn't been present at all of them, had made sure to have actual alibis for about half of the murders. He and Kara had agreed on a gruesome deal. Silver had been keeping her informed about the investigations, had warned her if necessary, and had advised her on how to effectively avoid leaving any evidence, and in return, Silver had been allowed to watch the murders whenever he had wanted to. What had gotten to Sarah the most was the fact that it had been his idea to murder Elizabeth. He had advertised his idea to Kara as the one way to effectively get Sarah off the case, but they all knew that in his sick mind, taking Elizabeth away from Sarah would leave her with no one and would ultimately give him the chance to get himself back into the picture. What he hadn't expected was the fact that Elizabeth's death would result in Sarah isolating herself completely, not even considering returning any of his rather insistent offers to distract her. But in the end, the trial passed. Kara Brand was pledged guilty of all charges and would spend the rest of her life in prison, while her brother was taken to a psychiatric hospital. The memories remained, would probably remain forever. A bitter taste, a constant reminder of what terrible things humans were capable of. But as time passed, they started to fade. And slowly, Sarah and Tally started to heal. And yet they fought. In fact, their first fight as a couple was so ordinary, so boringly normal, that in retrospect, it only showed Tally how far they had come. Tally and Sarah had decided to move in together a couple of months after the trial, after spending almost all of their time together anyway. They had quickly found a nice apartment, only a couple of blocks away from the department in Tally's old flat. It all seemed to go smoothly until they started a discussion about what color they would paint their kitchen in. The discussion soon turned into a full-blown argument, because when exactly had Sarah's taste gotten so terrible, and why in the goddess's name did Tally always need to be too stubborn for her own good? In the end, after some shouting, some half-hearted insults, and lots of angry staring, Tally had won. Of course she had. When had Sarah ever truly been able to resist one of Tally's wishes? Not when she was looking at her like this. Not when she was effectively using her body against Sarah. Not when she was pressing her up against the kitchen counter. Not when she was seemingly effortlessly lifting her up on said counter, placing heated kisses on her neck, and slowly teasing her with her fingers, until Sarah was panting heavily, begging Tally that she could paint the kitchen in whatever fucking color she wanted, if she'd finally take her properly. So, Tally did just that. The kitchen was painted in a dark forest green, and Tally was content. Still, they had to adjust themselves. They had given a very small housewarming party, and it had warmed Tally's heart that Sarah had insisted on inviting Detective Batan. Once the Camarilla killer case had officially been closed, she had transferred back to her actual department, and Tally would never admit this out loud, but she actually missed working with her. Missed the constant teasing, the witty comments, and the annoyed eye rolls. So she was incredibly happy to see that she and Sarah had apparently finally made peace with their past and had moved on to a genuine friendship. After the party, things slowly went back to normal, and Tally and Sarah had to get used to sharing a home. Naturally, living together always came with changes, but ultimately Sarah and Tally were both surprised by how little adjustment they actually needed. Sharing an apartment, coming home to each other every day, quickly felt like the most natural thing in the world. Just like at work, Tally and Sarah seemed to complete each other perfectly. Sarah turned out to be an incredible cook, whereas Tally was only incredible at leaving the kitchen in an absolute mess. So despite the still not exactly approved wall color, the kitchen soon became Sarah's territory. On the other hand, Tally simply loved grocery shopping. It calmed her down, whereas it took all of Sarah's self-control to not jump at the other customer's throat when they moved through the aisles with the speed of a fucking turtle that had been shot in the leg. And just like that, they found their routine. They agreed on things, they disagreed on things. They talked, and sometimes they just enjoyed being silent for a while. They argued, they kissed and made up. Actually, these were Tally's favorite parts. Their reconciliations, which were mostly louder and definitely more heated than the arguments themselves, and so much more satisfying. Despite the constant rush that naturally came with their job, their life was peaceful. They both knew this probably wasn't a permanent thing. It might only be the calm before the storm. They knew there would be other cases that would test them, other murders, other crimes that would push them to their limits. But after what they had already been through together, They were ready for whatever challenges life had in store for them next. For now, they were enjoying it as much as they could, appreciated each moment together, no matter how small it seemed. Moments like this quiet evening after a long day at work. Tally was lying in bed now, a book in her hand, but not really in the mood to focus on it. She could hear Sarah padding through the hallway on bare feet, apparently done with her shower, and lifted her head when she entered the bedroom. And then Tally gulped visibly, as her eyes appreciatively wandered up and down Sarah's body. She was only wearing a thin black satin robe that barely covered her ass. Technically, the robe was tied around her waist, but it still revealed enough of Sarah's upper body to make Tally's mouth go dry. She locked eyes with Sarah, not dropping her gaze once when she leaned over and placed her book on her bedside table. Then she licked her lips in anticipation. "Fuck, I love you." Sarah smiled softly, then teasingly quirked an eyebrow. "See something you like?" "I wouldn't complain about seeing some more," Tally smirked. And that was all it took. With 3 quick strides, Sarah made it through the room and was on the bed leaning over Tally moments later, hungrily pressing her lips onto hers. Almost immediately, one of Tally's hands wandered under the thin fabric of Sarah's robe, desperate to feel Sarah's hot skin on hers. She drew a content sigh from Sarah and then gasped in surprise when she felt Sarah's grasp around her wrist, firmly moving Tally's hands away from her body and over her head. Sarah broke the kiss. A wicked grin spread all over her face, and Tally knew she was in big trouble. She used one of her hands to fixate Tally's arms, and Tally could do nothing but watch through big eyes how Sarah leaned down and grabbed something from the ground that Tally couldn't see. Then Sarah's lips were on her neck, placing teasing kisses all the way up to her ear. Tally shivered and released a small moan when she felt Sarah's raspy breath tingling on her skin, ghosting over her ear. "Close your eyes for me," she murmured, and Tally followed her request immediately. Sarah shuffled slightly on top of her, and a moment later, Tally felt something cold and hard pressing against her wrists. She heard a clicking sound, and it only took her a moment to figure out that Sarah must have used her handcuffs to tie her hands to the metal bed frame. Arousal and excitement spread through Tally's body. Then Sarah's lips were back on her ear, her voice softer now, looking for consent. "Okay?" she asked. Tally barely manages a nod. "Yes." And that was all Sarah had been waiting for. When Tally opened her eyes again, she found a pair of desired clouded blue eyes already staring at her, ready to devour what was hers and hers alone. "Well then, Detective Craven," Sarah all but purred. "If you are a good girl and do exactly what I tell you, you might be allowed to touch later. But for now..." Sarah paused and took her sweet time letting her hands slowly wander over Tally's body, teasing her nipples through her shirt and drawing small, panting whimpers from her. Then she leaned forward again to finish her sentence, her voice dropping even lower. "Hands where I can see them." Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.